The Nigerian army said that it had rescued over 600 people during its operation in the Sambisa forest, the last remaining camp of Boko Haram insurgents in the country. In the space of 1 week, that is between December 7th and December 14th, 2016, the army disclosed that it had rescued 69 men, 180 women, 227 male children, and 129 female children in operations. Army officials said that the military operation aimed at flushing out Boko Haram troops and Operation Rescue Final have continued to record remarkable progress in the fight against terrorists in the Sambisa forest. He said that the victims are in their custody for further investigation and interrogation. On the operation, the troops are determined to wipe out the terrorists from their hideout, according to officials. The military chief was briefing the press at the headquarters of the 7th Division of Operation Lafayette in Maiduguri. President Buhari, on assumption of office, moved the military command to this area, which is home to the Boko Haram insurgency. The army has also taken the fight to Boko Haram since Buhari took charge. The army says the insurgents are now restricted to the forest, with their only threats being the use of suicide bombers, usually young girls, to attack soft targets.
Welcome back. Senegal's President Macky Sall told the Third International Forum of Dakar on Peace and Security in Africa that was held early this month that Africa must unite against terrorism, as it is the only way the continent can win against terrorists who are very well organized. Shireen Adel reports.
Senegal's President Macky Sall said that Africa must unite against terrorism. It is the only way the continent can win against terrorists who are very well organized. Sall was speaking at the Third International Forum of Dakar on Peace and Security in Africa. He added that with complex and multiple causes of terrorism, African armies needed to be better equipped to face terrorists all over the continent. He added that the United Nations peace operations should also up their game in the region. He also expressed concern that the conflict in Mali had turned into the bloodiest theater in the history of UN peacekeeping missions. Sall also said that the truth is that in most of the countries, the arms are not up to the mark, adding that they have to make internal efforts to raise their levels. UN bases in the country has been targeted by insurgents groups, leading to the deaths of troops and injuries to others. Attacks by militants linked to Al-Qaeda are rampant in the region. As at October 32, UN peacekeepers had been killed in the West African country this year alone. Armed rebels took control of northern Mali in 2012, prompting a French-led intervention that drove them from cities and towns in 2013. However, large tracts of the region still remain without control of either the UN or domestic troops.
Welcome back, our dear viewers. Today, President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi did start a visit, one-day visit to Uganda, during which he will meet with President Yoweri Museveni, President of Uganda. And of course, we are going to talk about the terrorism in the Black Continent with our dear guest in the studio, Dr. Ibrahim Al-Ghazawi, our security expert, and of course, our international security expert. Dr. Ibrahim, hello, sir, and thank you very much for being our guest for today.
Thank you.
Sir, today, President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi is starting a one-day official visit to Uganda, where he is expected to meet with President Yoweri Museveni to tackle mutual issues of concern for both countries, the issue of the Nile Basin states, and of course, the expected joint projects between both countries. How do you see the significance and the importance of this visit?
Well, I have to say that any visit to Africa, not only to Africa, but to the Nile Basin countries, it's a do visit today and yesterday and tomorrow. Yeah. And it has to be done repeatedly, probably on a weekly basis from the president himself.
Yeah.
What we have to recognize today, that our recent history relations with most of the African countries were not intact, were not in the line of the relations and how it should look like.
Yeah.
Why Africa? Because simply Africa is the depth of Egypt in terms of everything. When you talk about security, when you talk about markets and economy, when you talk about importing and exporting, when you talk about borders and geography. So, of course, on top of this comes Nile Basin countries that have been neglected for a long time in our recent history, and probably we have lost a lot because of this unacceptable negligence indeed. So when the president does a visit like that, with especially a country which is a prominent member of the Nile Basin countries, it means simply that the presidency today puts in place the priorities of having good relations with this group of countries indeed, that we have to fortify and consolidate our relations in all aspects indeed. Probably when we talk about Uganda, we recently have more than 62 programs, training programs, professional training to the police, military, education, cultural, and other different aspects of skills for the Ugandan professionals. So I do believe that this sort of visit today is a good chance to open what have been closed from our warm relations. And hopefully this is going to be extended to all other African countries, simply because not only me, but all whoever knows anything about Africa taken for granted that Africa is a positive answer to all our problems indeed. When you talk about a huge, wide market for our products, when you talk about the value, moral value, historical value of Egypt at the heart of all African countries and people, there is a sort of deep appreciation to Egypt. And I would say not most of the African countries, but all the African countries.
Yes.
This relation had been warm for a long time during Nasser time, and of course during Sadat time, and then it started to fade out until we reached, the point of sort of cold relation with the African countries. So I do believe today that we need to make another turn, positive turn in our relations with Uganda, with Kenya, with Ethiopia, of course, with Sudan, all African countries. We really need to have good relations with them.
Sir, what about the timing of the visit by the President to Uganda at this particular time frame?
Well, they always, you have always a reason for going to a Nile Basin country.
Indeed.
This is the source of life to Egypt and the source of life to all the countries on the Nile line. So I hope that this is sort of visit that is going to reiterate the fact of that we really need to cooperate, to open cooperation channels, all possible cooperation challenges with Uganda, and with other, with Kenya, with Ethiopia, with all other Nile Basin countries, Sudan, South Sudan. Yes, we have to admit that recently we didn't give due attention to our interests there. And our deep interests actually lie there in this part of the world, in this part of Africa. So when you talk about reason today, you have many reasons indeed. You have reasons to protect our life sources of water. You have reason to extend our economy aspirations to reach there through mutual investment. You have reason to open the Ugandan market for Egyptian products, fruits, etc., etc. You have a lot of reasons.
Indeed.
So while it came like there wasn't enough coverage for the visit before it happened, but it came at the right time. I mean, I hope that the president could pay such a visit on weekly basis to all the African countries.
Yes,
this is
indeed.
what
It's
it has
very
to be
important,
priority
of course.
to us.
Indeed. Still moving on to our main topic for discussion for today, which is the terrorism. Of course, we have witnessed a very sad incident last week, the explosion at the St. Mark Cathedral, and now we have been witnessing growing terrorism, not only in Egypt, but in the whole world and in Africa as well. So how do you assess the global terrorism threat now in the world?
Well, terrorism is an ugly, illegal activities because it spreads terror, fear, and instability.
Indeed.
And also it's blind when it comes to its targets. So sometimes most of the victims of terrorism are even civilian who didn't do anything.
Yes, of course. And sorry for interruption here, Dr. Ibrahim, but we have witnessed, unfortunately, last Sunday after the explosion that most of the victims were ladies and children,
yes, exactly.
worshippers at the church.
Exactly. So, so you have every reason to think the worst about terrorism, indeed. Because what happens usually on the ground when it comes to terrorism, there is no maturity, there is no wisdom in anything. That's why it's so dangerous. And I would always call it the most threatening problem to the recent state in its recent form, the political stability for recent states. Simply because it hits the feelings and the sensation of stability and tranquility. And that's the main issue about terrorism, that it spreads sort of fear among normal people on the street, that the country is not capable enough of protecting normal people in the street. And this is really very unacceptable by normal people. It casts doubt over the ability of the rule of law circles in any country. And that's why we witness different levels of terrorism influence over the different countries. Although we see terrorism activities in the first line countries, the first world countries as it may be called, like United States and
the
France,
developed country, the West, the United States.
Yeah. So we witness this incidents in these frontline countries or first line countries occasionally, with some intervals of time, because they have capabilities to detect, deter, and deal with decisively. When it comes to many African countries, they don't have such capabilities. That's why when terrorism hits there, it hits strongly in a very bloody way, and the response of the official circles of the state are not up to the challenge and the threat itself and the damage done on the ground. Why in Africa? Yeah, the reason is so clear, because most of the reasons that induce terrorism in Africa are the same, like in France and in United States and in other European countries, or in Turkey. It happens probably on a daily basis today in Turkey. The reasons are the same. Extremism. Extremism is an endless problem and has a lot of causes indeed. You talk about religious problems, about true understanding or genuine understanding of religion issues. You have problems of education, the ignorance of those who are recruited to be part of the gangs or the groups of terrorism. You have problems about the culture itself of those people. They are less educated, they are less cultured. And in many cases, they are very... So in absence of good governance, this is what makes it worse in Africa. In most of the cases, there is absence of good governance, like you have what you have in Somalia today.
If you have just mentioned Somalia, that would bring me to ask about the rise of these terrorist groups like Al-Shabaab in Somalia and Boko Haram in Nigeria. What's the main cause behind the rise of such terrorist groups?
Well, it's in Somalia, specifically you talk about Al-Shabaab. or the youth movement, which is the youth wing of the recently defunct movement of United Islamic Courts in Somalia. So you talk about pure extremism. You talk about full absence of the sensation of true religion of Islam there. And you talk about enthusiasm that is, it has no mind. So, of course, you have also an absence of the sustainable development priorities at these countries. So you have always problems there that are not solved timely, and this sort of problems that cause suffering to normal people in the street makes the environment very apt and suitable for cultivating that sort of violent activities. Probably it comes under some religious coverings, but behind these religious issues, they are sort of ignorance, they are another sort of being marginalized in their communities. So that's why we have always to shed the light on the root causes. This is the most important. The root causes is so important because only security reactions, yes, of course, security reactions are very vitally needed, and we cannot, we don't have the luxury of renouncing or letting aside the security confrontation. This is a must in our security. Whether here in Egypt or in any other country, the security comes from the police or the military. It's a must, because if you don't have enough power, enough physical power, enough armed forces, you cannot deter such activities. But what is behind that? This is a problem in Africa. There is no real analysis and real tracking of the causes and real handling of these causes. That's what makes terrorism in Africa chronic. It lasts for long years and years. And that's the problem in Africa today is not new. You talk about something probably in Somalia, for instance, in the early years of 1980s and 1990s. So you talk about a problem that is aged more than 25 years today without proper handling of the country. Comes back to Egypt here, because Egypt is different. Egypt is the rule of law circles in Egypt is strong enough. You have such terrorism waves, ups and down. So sometimes it comes up, sometimes it's totally under control.
Indeed, yes.
And that is the way in most of the other European countries, because here you have stable, strong, updated security forces, whether inside the police or the military forces. Of course, you talk about the border issues between the different African countries, and I have been there in most of the African countries repeatedly and visited a lot of the border lines between these countries. It's all, porous. There's no security measures on the line that divide the countries together. So it can be very easily made from anyone to move from country to another country, and that's what the Shabab are doing. They are doing incursions across the border with Kenya, with the border with Ethiopia, and other surrounding countries. Simply because there is no real control over the borders, and that's what makes the problem even harder and harsher for the official state in the African countries. Most of the border lines are not covered by security. Still, the problematic issue is not only not handling the issue inside the country itself, but the absence of real territorial cooperation in terms of encountering this problem effectively. Most of these terrorist groups, they are not functioning inside one particular country, but they are functioning in several countries around. That's Boko Haram in Nigeria, and that's also Al-Shabaab in Somalia, and that's also Akim, Al-Qaeda, Islamic group in the Maghreb region. All these groups, they are territorial. They are not just inside one particular country. means simply that they can move easily, they can mobilize easily their forces from one country to another.
Yes, indeed.
And that means simply that the governments have to do much more in terms of cooperation together. The database should be always exchanged, the threats exchanged, updates about confrontation, and updates about the weapons that such groups have at their hands. And there have to be sort of cooperation between these countries. It has been declared many times before that terrorism is not a problem that any country can deter alone.
Yes, indeed.
It has to be sort of territorial and sometimes international cooperation process.
Yes.
Because we talk about a problem that most of the world countries have.
Indeed,
So
yes.
it's also a moving crime. It's not one crime in one country. It's a supranational crime that can move easily from one country to another, and there are some links. Sophisticated tools, the technologies, the communication today makes the process much easier for these terrorism groups to communicate and to disseminate orders, to update their data among each other. Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan today can control what happens in Al-Qaeda in Maghreb al-Arabi or in Somalia. So you talk about the process of real cooperation between these terrorism and terrorist groups. But you don't have such good cooperation with the countries.
Indeed, Dr. Ibrahim Al-Ghazawi, our security expert, thank you very much, sir, for your precious input and for being our guest for today. And with that, our dear viewers, we come to the end of this edition of Africa Today. I'm Ahis Rabia signing off.